Okay, let's dive into this. You sent over some really interesting material about the Supreme Court, the unanimous decision regarding the 2024 ballot and former President Trump.
Yeah.
This one certainly, well, stirred things up, hasn't it?
It really has.
Hmm.
Quite a lot of reaction across the board.
So we're going to try and unpack what this decision actually means, sort of strip away the dense legal language, get to the core of why it matters.
Right.
Your sources definitely highlight that 9-0 vote, which is striking in itself.
Absolutely striking. Especially on a topic this charged.
And they hint at the impact, right, from the election itself to, I guess, the bigger picture of power in the U.S.
The balance of power question is key here.
So our mission really is to make sense of it for everyone listening. Pinpoint the crucial takeaways. Explore what it all implies.
And I think, starting with that unanimity you mentioned, that's fascinating right off the bat.
It is.
When you think about the different philosophies on the court, the different ways they usually approach things.
You're getting a 9-0 on this.
Exactly. It really tells you something about how they saw the central legal question, doesn't it?
Yeah, it must have been quite focused. So, okay, the absolute core ruling. The court said 9-0 states cannot block Trump from the presidential ballot.
That's the headline.
And this overturns those decisions we saw earlier from Colorado and Maine and Illinois, too.
Correct. Those state-level actions are now void, essentially.
And the legal hook for all this, the basis, is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Precisely. Section 3. And, it's worth remembering the context there. Post-Civil War amendment.
Right.
Aimed at people who'd taken an oath to the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection or rebellion.
That part about not holding office if you've done that. But the key thing the court clarified here is who gets to enforce that right, especially for federal jobs like the presidency.
That's the absolute crux of this decision. They were very clear. Only Congress have the authority to enforce Section 3 against federal candidates.
Individual states.
Not individual states.
Yeah.
And you can see the logic. I mean, imagine the alternative.
Oh, total chaos.
Right, you'd have potentially 50 different states with 50 different interpretations deciding who's eligible to be president. It would be unworkable.
Yeah, a candidate could be on the ballot in Texas, but off in California based on different state court rulings on the same constitutional clause. That feels wrong for a national election.
Exactly. And Chief Justice Roberts actually highlighted that exact point. He stressed this need for uniformity.
For national elections, yeah.
Sure.
To protect the democratic process itself.
Makes sense.
So this clear statement on federal power, well, that leads directly to the impact on Trump's campaign.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is undeniably a significant win for him.
Removes those specific legal challenges in those states, clears the immediate path for him to be on all the ballots.
It does. Those state-level roadblocks are gone.
And the material you sent suggests his team will likely, well, make a lot of noise about this, frame it as a win against a system they claim is rigged.
You can almost hear the rally speeches now, can't you?
Yeah.
And look, that framing, however you feel about it politically, it's a direct result of this ruling. It gives them that talking point.
It bolsters their narrative that these efforts were illegitimate. And hey, look, the Supreme Court agrees with us unanimously even.
Precisely. Now, going back to that unanimity, that's something your sources really zeroed in on too. It's surprising, isn't it?
It really is. Given how divided the court often seems on major issues, especially politically sensitive ones, a 9-0, that's remarkable.
It took a lot of legal experts by surprise, too, across the political spectrum.
So what does that suggest? That maybe the justices, despite their differences, agreed strongly on this specific point about federal authority versus state authority in this context.
That seems plausible. Perhaps a shared concern about letting national elections become fragmented,
Yeah.
A state-by-state patchwork.
Like a fundamental agreement on the mechanics, even if they might disagree on other things.
Could be. But, as your info points out, just because they agreed legally on who decides doesn't mean everyone's happy with the outcome.
Right. There are critics saying, okay, maybe the legal point about Congress is correct, but this ruling kind of sidesteps the whole underlying issue.
Yeah.
The actual accusation of insurrection.
That's a really crucial distinction people are making. The court didn't rule on whether the accusations themselves were true or false.
No.
They ruled on the process. Who has the power to act on those kinds of accusations at the presidential level?
So supporters, on the other hand, they see this as, what's the term? Judicial restraint.
Yeah, that's the argument, that the court correctly limited its decision to the specific legal question before it.
Meaning they didn't sort of overreach into deciding the factual or political stuff they didn't strictly need to?
Exactly. The argument is they focused on a core principle. keeping a clear national standard for presidential ballot access and preventing state courts from becoming, political battlegrounds over this.
Which really does shine a light on that constant tension, doesn't it? Federal power versus state power.
Hmm.
This ruling feels like a pretty strong reaffirmation that federal elections are, well, federal,
Yeah.
national.
Yeah, it leans that way. It says that interpreting constitutional qualifications for federal office isn't something states can just decide independently through their own courts.
States still control their local election stuff, like polling places, voter registration rules.
Oh, absolutely. Their authority over state and local elections isn't really touched by this. But for federal candidates, particularly the president, this ruling limits their power to interpret those constitutional bars.
So you could see it as pushing towards more consistent standards nationwide for who can run for president?
You could frame it that way, yes. More uniformity.
Okay, so looking down the road, this big question comes up. Could Congress still act? Could they use Section 3 to disqualify a candidate?
Technically, yes. The court explicitly said the power lies with Congress.
But your material calls that politically unlikely. Why is that? Just the difficulty of getting Congress to agree on something so huge.
Well, that's a big part of it. Think about the current political climate. Getting the kind of consensus needed, likely a supermajority in both the House and Senate.
Yeah, that seems like a very, very high bar right now.
It is. Plus, there'd be procedural complexities, debates about evidence. I mean, it would be a massive undertaking.
So while the door is legally open, practically speaking, it seems mostly shut.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah. Politically very difficult.
And this ruling, does it set a precedent for the future? Does it signal the court might be hesitant about other kinds of disqualification attempts?
It certainly suggests a strong emphasis on democratic access to the ballot, especially at the presidential level.
Like, the bar for removing a major candidate is and should be extremely high.
That seems to be the signal. The court seems to be saying, let the voters decide unless there's a clear congressionally mandated reason based on the Constitution.
It prioritizes the voter's choice, in a way.
You could argue that yes, that removing a candidate is such a significant step, it requires this very specific national process through Congress.
But your sources also flag some concerns from legal scholars, right?
Mm-hmm.
People worried this was maybe a missed opportunity.
Yes, there's that perspective too. Some worry that by focusing only on who decides, the court didn't give us clearer guidelines on the substance. Like what actually counts as insurrection under Section 3? What's the standard of proof?
They left those tricky questions unanswered because they didn't need to answer them for this case.
Exactly. And some scholars feel that leaves a kind of ambiguity hanging over things.
But others, as your sources also say, think the court did the right thing. That wading into those questions would have been, what, too political, too messy.
Right. That perspective praises the court for sticking to the procedural lane, for avoiding getting bogged down in factual disputes or appearing to take political sides, and instead upholding what they see as essential democratic electoral norms.
So, two different takes on whether the court was being prudent or perhaps avoiding a tough but necessary question.
That's a good way to put it. It highlights the complexity here.
Okay, so wrapping this up, trying to make sense of it all, what's the big picture takeaway for someone listening?
Well, I think it boils down to this. The Supreme Court has strongly prioritized national uniformity for presidential elections.
Okay.
And it's clearly placed the power, the authority to disqualify federal candidates for insurrection squarely with Congress, not the states.
So, immediate political impact for 2024, obviously.
Definitely. Clears the path for Trump onto all ballots.
And longer-term implications for that state versus federal power balance, specifically around presidential.
Yes, it reinforces federal authority in that specific domain.
But it leaves us with this kind of final thought, doesn't it? A provocative one. The court told us who decides on ballot access.
Right, Congress.
But that underlying really difficult question about accountability, about what happens when someone is accused of actions related to insurrection, that question hasn't gone away.
No, it hasn't. It remains unresolved, legally and politically. It's still out there as a potential, flashpoint for the future.
So it makes you wonder, what other questions does this raise about our elections going forward and how we continue to interpret the Constitution in these pretty challenging times?
Exactly. It settles one major question but leaves others simmering.